What if the most famous treasure mystery of World War II is not really a mystery at all? What if it is something stranger than that? What if it is a story the world simply decided to believe, not because the evidence was strong enough, but because the truth was too boring to accept? That is the question at the heart of what people call the Nazi gold train. For 80 years, this story has refused to die. It has pulled treasure hunters into dark tunnels beneath the mountains of Poland. It has triggered international media frenzies. It has sent governments scrambling to figure out who owns something that may not even exist. It has made ordinary people risk their lives chasing a train that has never been confirmed, never been photographed, and never produced a single verified piece of physical evidence. And yet the story keeps going. Why? That is what we are going to find out today, because here is what most documentaries about the gold train will not tell you. The most fascinating part of this story is not the gold. It is not the tunnels or the radar scans or the dramatic press conferences. The most fascinating part is what this story reveals about us. About human beings, about what we are willing to believe when the alternative, that history is messy and does not always give us the endings we want, is simply too unsatisfying to live with. This video is going to take you through the full story, the history, the searches, the claims, the corrections, the uncomfortable facts that get left out of the exciting version. And by the end, you're going to have something very few people who followed this story actually have. Not the gold, the truth. Stay with me. Because this story is wilder, stranger, and more honest than anything you have seen about it before. It is January 1945. Nazi Germany is dying. The Soviet Red Army is tearing through Poland from the east. The Allied forces are pushing in from the west. Cities are falling fast. The Nazi Empire, built on terror, theft, and violence, is collapsing in real time. But even as the walls close in, certain people inside the Nazi leadership are not panicking. They are planning. They are thinking about one very urgent problem. What do you do with stolen wealth when your empire is falling apart? Because the Nazis had stolen an almost incomprehensible amount. For 12 years, they looted every country they occupied. They stripped Jewish families of everything: gold, jewelry, savings, artwork, wedding rings, before sending them to death camps. They raided national treasuries across Europe: France, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, all of it taken. Here is something important, though. By January 1945, much of that wealth had already been moved. The Nazis were organized. They had been relocating their most valuable assets for months to salt mines, underground bunkers, and secure facilities deeper inside German territory. The famous Merkers mine discovery by American forces in April 1945 confirmed this. Billions of dollars worth of gold, currency, and art, all carefully moved and hidden before the end came. So the city of Breslau, known today as Wrocław in Poland, was not holding the main Nazi treasury in early 1945. Most serious historians believe the really significant assets had already been evacuated long before the Soviet offensive arrived, but something was still there: local treasury assets. Regional valuables not yet evacuated, and as Soviet forces closed in, there was genuine panic about what to do with whatever remained. This is where the legend begins. According to post-war accounts, from locals, former soldiers, people who claimed to witness the final chaotic days, a train was loaded somewhere in the Breslau region, carrying valuables. Moving west, away from the Soviets, no railway record of this train has ever been confirmed. No official Nazi order for such an operation has ever been found. German records from this period are deeply incomplete, destroyed, abandoned, or simply never written as the regime collapsed. What we have instead are stories, powerful stories. Consistent in some details, contradictory in others, part memory, part rumor, part the human need to make sense of chaos. A train went somewhere, or it did not. The honest answer is that we do not know. What we know is that enormous wealth was stolen, the end of the war was chaos, and not everything was ever accounted for. That gap in the record is where the legend of the Nazi gold train was born, and once a legend like that is born, it takes on a life that facts alone can rarely stop. After the war ended, Europe was trying to survive. Cities were rubble. Borders had been redrawn overnight. Millions were dead or displaced. Governments were focused on food, shelter, and order. Nobody in any official capacity had time to chase rumors about missing trains. But in the mountains of Lower Silesia in southwestern Poland, the rumors were already spreading. This region had changed hands violently. It had been part of Nazi Germany, then the Soviets swept through, then it became Polish territory as borders were redrawn. The German population was expelled. Polish families were resettled there instead, a whole new population living on top of a landscape saturated with wartime secrets, and those secrets had a way of surfacing. Local people talked about a heavy train, moving through the mountains at night in the final days of the war, armed guards, no markings. Heading toward the Owl Mountains, a forested range of hills the Nazis had used for something extraordinary, something called Project Reese. Project Reese, giant in German, was one of the most ambitious construction projects the Nazi regime ever attempted. Starting in 1943, the Nazis forced tens of thousands of prisoners to dig a vast tunnel network beneath the Owl Mountains. Most were Jewish men and women dragged from concentration camps. They worked in brutal conditions with almost no food, no medical care, and no protection from violence. Thousands died. The exact number will never be known. The tunnels they built are real. You can visit some today. What were they for? Even serious historians disagree. The most accepted theory is that Project Reese was meant to be Hitler's new underground headquarters. Others believe it was for weapons production. The Nazis destroyed most of the project records before the war ended, so the full picture remains unclear. But here is what the tunnels were almost certainly not designed for: hiding a train. This is a critical point that often gets skipped in the exciting version of the story. The Project Reese tunnels vary significantly in size. Many sections are simply not wide enough or tall enough to fit a full-size train with armored carriages. The dramatic image of an intact armored train sitting in a sealed underground chamber does not match what we know about the actual tunnel dimensions. Smaller objects, crates, documents, yes. A whole armored train, considerably more complicated than the legend suggests. The legend, as legends do, had improved on reality, and then came the story that gave the legend its most powerful fuel. In the years after the war, a story circulated about a dying man who confessed to knowing where the train was hidden. He claimed to have been involved in loading it. He named a location near the town of WWII. He said the tunnel was sealed. He said the gold was still inside. It sounds deeply compelling. The kind of first-hand testimony that makes a mystery feel suddenly real. But here is what you need to know. Polish authorities never confirmed this person existed. No name was ever verified. No documentation of the confession was ever produced. Researchers who investigated could not trace it to any confirmed individual. What appeared to be a credible first-hand account turned out to be a rumor that had been repeated so many times it had taken on the weight of testimony, without ever actually being testimony. The chaos of 1945 generated hundreds of similar stories across Central Europe. Most turned out to be false. The Gold Train confession sits in that frustrating middle ground, impossible to confirm, impossible to dismiss, and powerful enough to drive searches for decades regardless. By the 1960s, the legend had grown beyond the local community. It was pulling in a very particular kind of person, the treasure hunter. And with the treasure hunters came something that has shaped this story ever since: greed. There is something that treasure does to people before they have even found it, just the idea of it. The possibility, the thought that somewhere beneath your feet, separated by nothing but rock and time, there is more wealth than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. It does not matter how rational you are. That thought opens a door, and what walks through that door is not always a version of yourself you would be proud of. From the 1950s onward, the region around WWII became a quiet but persistent magnet for treasure seekers. Some were genuine historians with serious research methods. Some were amateurs with metal detectors and hand-drawn maps. Some were driven by something rawer, pure financial desperation, dressed up as historical curiosity. They all told themselves the same story, that they were the one who had finally pieced it together. That this expedition, this tunnel, this sealed shaft was going to be the one that changed everything. Almost none of them found anything conclusive. But almost none of them left fully convinced the train did not exist either. That is the particular cruelty of this kind of search. It never gives you a clean answer. You never find the train. But you never find proof that it is not there, and so you come back. In the 1970s, a joint team of German and Polish researchers announced they had identified what appeared to be a sealed tunnel entrance near WWII. Their instruments detected anomalies. They applied for permission to excavate. Permission was denied. The political situation made excavation essentially impossible. Poland was under Soviet-backed communist rule. The question of who would own any treasure found was politically toxic from every angle. Germany had no standing to claim anything. The Soviet Union had its own interests. Jewish organizations had legitimate moral claims. The Polish government took the path of least resistance. They said no. The shaft stayed sealed, but that search did something important. Even without a discovery, it produced documentation. The team's findings were written up. A specific location was recorded. That gave future researchers something earlier searches never had: a named, mapped target. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the searches continued. Technology improved slowly. Research became more serious, but the fundamental problem never went away. The tunnel network is vast. Significant sections remain unexplored, flooded, or structurally unstable. Records that might have pointed to a specific location had been destroyed or never existed, and the eyewitnesses who actually lived through 1945 were dying one by one, taking their memories with them. By the early 2000s, the gold train occupied a strange position, too well documented to dismiss as pure fantasy, too unproven to accept as established fact. And into that vacuum came the thing that always fills a vacuum in a story about hidden treasure: more hunters, bigger claims, and eventually the kind of announcement that stops the world. But before we get there, I need to pause on something the treasure hunt narrative almost always skips: the physical reality of the tunnels these hunters were searching through. These were not empty spaces waiting to be explored. These were places where people had been worked to death, where prisoners, stripped of their names and their humanity, drilled through solid rock in conditions of almost unimaginable brutality, where men and women took their last breaths in the dark, far from everyone they loved. Every researcher who entered those tunnels with a metal detector was walking through a place of mass suffering. Very few of them stopped to think about that. That imbalance between the romance of the hunt and the horror of the history runs through this entire story like a fault line. It matters. It matters more than the gold. We will come back to it. It started with a lawyer's office in WWII. August 2015. Two men walk in, one Polish, one German, Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter. They sit down, open a folder, and make an announcement that will circle the globe within 48 hours. They have found the train, not probably, not possibly, found it. Their ground-penetrating radar scans show a train-shaped object buried approximately 9 meters underground near WWII, with what appears to be armored carriages attached. In exchange for revealing the precise location, they want 10% of the total value of whatever is found. The story leaks almost immediately, and the world goes absolutely crazy. Within 2 days, the Nazi gold train is on the front pages of newspapers across Europe, America, and Asia. Television crews arrive from a dozen countries. Social media explodes. WWII, a quiet post-industrial city most people outside Poland had never heard of, suddenly becomes the most talked-about place on Earth. Hotels fill overnight. Tourists flood in. The mayor gives interview after interview. A Polish government spokesman uses the word credible to describe the claim, and that single word pours rocket fuel onto an already roaring fire. But serious questions form almost immediately. The first problem is fundamental. Koper and Richter have not actually seen anything. Their entire claim rests on radar data. And ground-penetrating radar is not a camera. It detects anomalies, differences in density beneath the surface. But their chosen location sits directly above a known section of the Project Reese tunnel network, already full of old tunnel walls, metal support beams, and collapsed passages. Any scan of that zone was always going to produce interesting readings. The real question was never whether the scan found something. It was whether that something was a train or just 80-year-old tunnel infrastructure. The Polish government responds carefully. Official geologists are sent to the site. Military explosives experts examine the area for unexploded ordnance, a genuine and ongoing danger across Lower Silesia. The authorities make clear that no private excavation will happen until safety and legal questions are fully addressed. Then the results come in from AGH University of Science and Technology in Krakow, one of Poland's most respected scientific institutions. Their conclusion is direct and unambiguous. There is no train at the location identified by Koper and Richter. The anomalies in the radar data are consistent with natural rock formations and existing tunnel infrastructure. Nothing at that site cannot be explained by known underground geology. No train, no armored carriages, nothing. Koper and Richter push back. They insist the wrong area was scanned. They maintain their claim. With private investor backing, they eventually obtain permission to conduct an actual physical excavation. They dig, and they find nothing. Not a rail, not a wheel. Not a bolt, just soil, rock, the ordinary underground geology of a Polish hillside that has been there for millions of years. The excavation that was supposed to prove the survey wrong produced the most definitive result in the history of the gold train story. Nothing is there. The media retreats as fast as it arrived. By early 2016, the cameras are gone. The tourists thin out. Walbrzych goes back to being a quiet city in southwestern Poland. Now here is the important distinction. The 2015 episode disproved one specific claim at one specific location. It did not prove that nothing exists anywhere in the wider Project WWII system. The tunnels cover a significant area. One excavation is not a complete search, but it showed what happens when the most dramatic gold train claim in history is subjected to rigorous scientific testing. It disappears into ordinary rock and soil, and the quiet reality that sometimes a story, however compelling, however desperately believed, is just a story. Let's stop here. Let's put down the drama and look carefully at what the historical record actually supports. Because a lot has been said about the Nazi gold train over 80 years by journalists, treasure hunters, documentary makers, and governments. Not all of it deserves equal weight. Here is what we know for certain. Nazi looting was real and enormous. The documented evidence is overwhelming. The Nazis systematically stripped wealth from every occupied country, from national treasuries, museums, private homes, and people being sent to death camps. The scale runs into hundreds of billions in today's values across all of occupied Europe. Project WWII was real. The tunnels exist, built by forced laborers between 1943 and 1945. Thousands died building them. Parts of the network remain unexplored. The Breslau region held some Nazi assets in early 1945, and the final weeks of the war there were genuinely chaotic. Nazi officials were making individual decisions about hiding valuables as the regime collapsed. Hidden Nazi caches have genuinely been found since the war. The Merkers mine alone held billions in gold, currency, and art. Hidden Nazi treasure is not fantasy. It is documented history with confirmed examples. Now here is what we do not know. We do not know whether a specific train loaded with treasure actually departed the Breslau region. No railway record has ever been confirmed. No official Nazi order for such an operation has ever been found. We do not know whether the deathbed confession ever happened. The person was never identified. Polish authorities never confirmed his existence. It was an unverified rumor that accumulated credibility through repetition, not a documented account. We do not know whether anything train-sized is hidden in the tunnel network. The most serious claim ever made was tested by scientists, confirmed empty, then physically excavated and found to contain nothing. And here is the point that gets discussed least honestly. We do not know that Breslau even held enough treasure to justify the legend. By early 1945, the most significant Nazi assets had already been moved months earlier to more secure locations deeper in German territory. Breslau was an important city, but it was a city under siege. The idea that it held an intact, enormous treasury waiting to be loaded onto one train does not align well with how the Nazi financial system actually worked in its final months. Whatever was there was almost certainly more modest than 80 years of retelling suggests. Now the Soviet question. When the Soviets captured the Breslau region, they swept it thoroughly. The Soviet Union ran an organized, official trophy collection program, dedicated military units whose job was to identify, catalog, and remove valuables from captured territories. They kept detailed records. This is the crucial point. The Soviet trophy brigades were not looting secretly or chaotically. They documented everything. If they had captured a train full of Nazi gold, that would have been recorded as a major victory, celebrated, not hidden. No such record has ever surfaced from Soviet archives. Which means one of two things. Either there was no train for the Soviets to find, or records exist somewhere in Russian archives that have never been made accessible to outside researchers. Both possibilities are real, but the organized nature of Soviet trophy collection actually makes a completely undocumented seizure of this scale less likely than it might first appear. Where does this leave us with a story significantly less solid than it is usually presented? A legend built on unverified testimony, an unconfirmed confession, inflated treasure estimates, and physical claims that failed scientific testing. Does that mean the train definitely does not exist? No, it means the honest answer, the only defensible answer, is that we do not know. The evidence for the train's existence is weaker than the exciting version of the story suggests. And the burden of proof has never been met by anyone who has claimed to be close to finding it. That is not satisfying, but it is honest. And in a story this old and complicated, honesty is worth more than excitement. I want to stop the treasure hunt completely for a moment. Set aside the radar scans and the surveys and the competing theories. Step back from the excitement and the romantic idea of sealed tunnels and hidden gold. Because there is a dimension to this story that almost never gets the space it deserves. It is the most important part. Let's talk about the tunnels themselves, not what might be hidden inside. The tunnels, what they are, what it costs to build them. The Project Reese network was not built by machines or willing workers. It was built by human beings who had been reduced deliberately, systematically, as official Nazi policy to the status of tools, people given numbers instead of names, separated from families. Stripped of everything, transported in cattle cars to a place where their only value was the labor their bodies could produce before those bodies gave out. Between 1943 and 1945, somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 forced laborers worked on Project Reese. Most were Jewish prisoners from concentration camps across occupied Europe. They worked in shifts. Underground, cold, wet, drilling through solid rock with inadequate equipment, breathing dust and fumes, eating almost nothing. Their overseers were brutal. Beatings were routine. Anyone who could not keep up risked being beaten, shot, or sent somewhere worse. There was nobody to complain to. There was just the rock and the darkness and the violence. Thousands of these workers died during construction. The exact number will never be known. The Nazis did not keep careful records of the deaths of people they had decided were subhuman. These tunnels are, in the most literal possible sense, a mass grave, and for 80 years, treasure hunters have been crawling through them looking for gold. Sit with that for a moment. The disconnect between those two realities, the horror of what the tunnels are, and the excitement of how they are treated in the gold train story, is not a small thing. It is a profound moral failure in how this story has been told across 8 decades. The gold on that train, if it exists, was not neutral war booty. It was people's gold. Wedding rings pulled from fingers on the way to gas chambers, savings handed over at gunpoint, the jewelry of children, dental gold extracted from the mouths of the dead. That is where the treasure came from. Any story that treats the search for it as pure adventure is choosing entertainment over truth in a way that does real harm to the memory of the dead, to the dignity of their descendants, and to our own understanding of what this story actually is. Organizations dedicated to Holocaust remembrance have spoken about this for decades. The gold train narrative, in its popular romanticized form, tends to center the treasure and sideline the people it was stolen from. The mystery becomes the story. The human beings whose suffering produce the mystery become background detail. That inversion is wrong. The human cost of this story did not end in 1945 either. When Koper and Richter made their 2015 announcement, unauthorized treasure hunters flooded Walbazich within days. They dug illegally on protected land. They entered unstable tunnels without proper equipment. Several people were injured. Police were deployed to keep people away from sensitive sites. Local residents found strangers knocking on their doors at all hours, offering money for information. The community that had quietly carried this legend for generations suddenly found itself at the center of a global gold rush it had never asked to host. Gold does this. The idea of gold does this. It distorts normal human judgment. It makes people willing to trespass, lie, and take risks they would never accept in any other context. But there is something specific about the Nazi gold train that makes this particular greed especially troubling. The people competing for a share of this treasure are competing for wealth that was taken from people who were then murdered. They are fighting over the proceeds of a crime whose victims never received justice and whose descendants are still alive. That is not a treasure hunt. that is something significantly darker. If the train is ever found, the question of what happens to whatever is on it is not primarily a legal question or a political question. It is a moral question. Whose was it? It belonged to people who were murdered for it, people whose descendants are still here, still waiting, still watching a story about their family's stolen wealth be told as an adventure. That needs to change, and the first step is saying it out loud, putting it at the center of the story where it belongs, not after the excitement, not as a disclaimer, at the center. After 80 years, serious researchers have arrived at 4 main theories about what actually happened. Each has genuine reasoning behind it. Each has genuine weaknesses. None has been definitively proven. Let's go through them honestly. Theory 1. The train is still in the tunnels. A train loaded with Nazi treasure entered the Project Reese network near Walbazich in early 1945. The entrance was sealed. The men who knew its location were silenced. The train is still sitting there, in a section never properly identified or excavated. What supports it? The network is vast and incompletely explored. Local testimony across multiple decades was geographically consistent. The Nazis did genuinely hide assets in underground facilities elsewhere, confirmed by post-war discoveries. What weakens it? Many tunnel sections are too narrow for a full-size armored train. The best-funded claim in the story's history, Koper and Richter in 2015, was scientifically surveyed, physically excavated, and found to contain nothing. The foundational testimony, the deathbed confession, was never verified. Verdict cannot be completely ruled out. But the cumulative weight of failed searches and weak foundational evidence makes this the least supported theory by the standards of serious historical inquiry. Theory 2. The Soviets took it. The treasure never made it into any tunnel. It was still in the Breslau region when the Soviets arrived. They absorbed it into their trophy collection system and shipped it east. What supports it? Soviet trophy collection was real, organized, and operated on an enormous scale. The Breslau region was thoroughly swept. Russian archives have never been fully opened to outside researchers. What weakens it? The Soviet trophy brigades kept detailed records. They documented their seizures. A capture of an entire trainload of Nazi gold would have been recorded as a major victory, not quietly hidden. No such record has surfaced. And if the Soviets took it, where did it go? The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Archives were partially opened. The idea that a discovery of this magnitude stayed completely secret through the entire post-Soviet period requires a level of sustained secrecy history suggests is very difficult to maintain. Verdict: historically grounded in real Soviet behavior, but the organized nature of trophy collection actually works against this theory rather than for it. Theory 3. The train never existed. The whole thing is a legend. Wartime chaos generated hundreds of similar stories across Central Europe. Most were false. The gold train is simply the most persistent and dramatically compelling of them. What supports it? The complete absence of confirmed documentary evidence, no railway record, no official order. No verified witness account, no physical evidence in 80 years of searching. The 2015 excavation, the most rigorous test the story has ever faced, found nothing. In a regime as obsessed with documentation as Nazi Germany, the total silence of the historical record about an operation this supposed size is genuinely significant. What does it struggle to explain? The geographic consistency of post-war local testimony, the documented reality that Nazi officials did hide assets in the region as the war ended. And the basic question, if there was no train, where exactly did the regional assets of the Breslau Nazi administration go in those final weeks? Verdict: supported by the strongest single piece of evidence, the failed 2015 excavation, and the complete absence of documentary confirmation, the most skeptically honest position. Difficult to maintain as absolute certainty, but the position the evidence most naturally points toward. Theory 4. The treasure was scattered. There was no single gold train. The treasure was dispersed in multiple directions by different people making different decisions under extreme pressure. Some went by train, possibly more than one train. Some was hidden locally by individual Nazi officials. Some was captured by the Soviets as routine trophy collection. Some was taken by civilians. Some was simply lost. What supports it? It fits the historical reality of the Nazi endgame better than any other theory. the final weeks of the regime were not a period of organized, coordinated action. They were institutional collapse and individual panic. The idea that a single massive treasure operation was executed cleanly, one train, one destination, one sealed tunnel, leaving absolutely no documentary trace, requires believing Nazi organizational efficiency survived perfectly intact right up to the moment of total collapse. The historical evidence suggests it did not. It also explains why no search has found everything, because there is no single everything to find. What does it struggle to explain? Its own shapelessness. It gives researchers no single target. It does not produce a satisfying conclusion. In a story driven by the human hunger for a clean answer, a theory that says the truth is complicated and scattered is genuinely difficult to accept, but difficult to accept does not mean wrong. Verdict: historically the most credible, the most consistent with how the Nazi regime actually functioned in its final weeks, the least dramatic, and quite possibly the closest to the truth. The most exciting theory, the train sealed in a tunnel, waiting to be found, is the least supported by the evidence. The most boring theory, treasure scattered and partially lost in chaos, is the most historically credible. That gap between excitement and credibility is exactly how legends survive long after the evidence against them has accumulated. The cameras left Walbazich a long time ago. The journalists flew home. The tourists stopped coming. The city settled back into quiet everyday life, a little more famous than before, but fundamentally unchanged by the frenzy that had briefly made it the most talked-about place on Earth. But the search did not stop, it just changed. It got quieter, more methodical. Less driven by dramatic announcements and more driven by the slow, unglamorous work of serious researchers who believe this question deserves a proper scientific investigation, not another cycle of bold claims and public disappointment. The most credible ongoing research approaches the Project Reese network differently than any previous search. Earlier searches started with a conclusion and looked for evidence to support it. The deathbed confession pointed to a location. The radar anomaly suggested a hillside. Researchers went there already convinced of what they would find. That approach is how you end up with 2015. You find what you expect because you are looking with the eyes of someone who has already decided what is there. The current approach asks a simpler, more honest question. What is actually in these tunnels, every accessible section, mapped completely, documented thoroughly, without prior assumptions? The technology supporting this work is genuinely extraordinary by historical standards. Modern ground-penetrating radar operates at greater depths, with significantly higher resolution and software that filters out the geological noise that caused so many false positives in earlier searches. LiDAR technology uses laser pulses to build three-dimensional models of underground spaces with millimeter-level accuracy. It can detect variations in wall thickness that might indicate a sealed passage. It can map tunnel interiors without anyone physically entering, which matters greatly where sections are unstable or flooded. Thermal imaging adds another layer. Different materials release heat at different rates. A section of wall-concealing metal will produce a different thermal signature than solid rock, and then there is artificial intelligence. AI-enhanced analysis of geological and scanning data can process the enormous volumes of raw information faster and more thoroughly than human analysts. A subtle signature buried deep in a dataset that a tired human analyst might miss could be flagged by an AI system trained on comparable data. That does not mean the AI is always right. But it means the data is being interrogated more thoroughly than ever before. Does this mean a discovery is imminent? No. Better technology does not solve the fundamental problem. The network is vast. Many sections remain genuinely inaccessible, and the historical record pointing researchers toward any specific location remains frustratingly weak. The unexploded ordnance problem also continues to slow every search. Polish military disposal units still regularly recover and detonate World War II ordnance across Lower Silesia today. Every potential excavation site must be certified safe by explosives experts first. That process cannot be rushed. The legal landscape continues to develop in parallel. Poland maintains that anything found underground on Polish territory belongs to the Polish state. Jewish heritage organizations have established legal frameworks to pursue claims on assets identified as Holocaust-era stolen property. Germany maintains a low public profile while signaling through diplomatic channels that it expects to be part of any formal process. The broader conversation, the gold train, connects to remains active and unresolved. European museums are under increasing pressure to complete provenance research on works that may have passed through Nazi hands. The Washington Principles of 1998 committed 44 nations to resolving Nazi-looted art claims. Nearly 30 years later, implementation remains deeply uneven. Here is the honest reality of where the search stands after 80 years, after dozens of expeditions. After one global media frenzy, one professional scientific survey, and one physical excavation that found nothing. After technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the treasure hunters of the 1960s, we still do not know. The tunnel network has not been completely mapped. Russian archives have not been fully opened. And the scattered treasure theory, the most historically credible possibility, suggests that even a complete search of Project Reese might not produce a definitive answer. Because the answer may simply not be there to find. The search continues, quietly, seriously, with better tools and a clearer understanding of both what we are looking for and how limited our ability to find it may prove to be. That combination, serious effort, honest limitation, genuine uncertainty, is the most mature and most truthful place this story has ever been. We have come a long way together. We started in the chaos of a collapsing empire in January 1945. We followed a legend through 80 years of rumor, obsession, failed searches, and one spectacular public disappointment. We looked honestly at what the evidence supports and what it does not. We sat with the uncomfortable human reality underneath the adventure story. And we arrived here at the end without the clean resolution part of us was hoping for. No confirmed train, no gold gleaming in the torchlight. No moment where the mystery snaps shut and everything makes sense. Just the open question, still open. After all this time, history does not owe us closure. The past does not reorganize itself into satisfying narratives just because we want it to. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say about something that happened 80 years ago is simply this: we do not fully know, we may never fully know. And pretending otherwise, dressing ambiguity in false certainty to make a better story, is a disservice to the truth and to the people whose real lives sit at the center of it. So let me tell you what this story is actually about. Not the gold, not the tunnels, not the radar scans or the deathbed confession. This story is about what happens to stolen things. When something is ripped away from people who had no power to stop it, what happens to it afterward? Sometimes it is recovered. Sometimes it changes hands so many times the original theft becomes buried under layers of history, and sometimes it simply disappears, into a tunnel, into a warehouse. Into the silence of powerful institutions that would prefer certain questions were never asked. The Nazi regime stole on a scale that has no historical parallel. They did not just steal objects. They stole identities, futures, entire communities from the map of European civilization. And the material wealth they took, the gold, the art, the savings of millions of families, was just one dimension of a theft so vast that 80 years of reckoning have not been enough to fully account for it. There are thousands of artworks in European museums right now that were looted from Jewish families and never returned. Some institutions know their provenance and have chosen not to act. There are properties across Germany, Austria, Poland, and France seized from Jewish owners between 1933 and 1945, whose rightful heirs have been fighting court systems for decades. There are Swiss bank accounts opened by Jewish families before the war and never reclaimed, because the families were murdered and their descendants could not navigate the deliberately obstructive processes required to access them. The Washington Principles of 1998 committed 44 nations to resolving Nazi-looted art claims. Nearly 30 years later, implementation remains deeply uneven. Some countries have made genuine efforts. Others have found technical legal reasons to avoid resolving claims that are morally straightforward. The Gold Train is one story within this enormous, ongoing, unfinished story of what was taken and what has never been given back. That context, that bigger picture, is what gives it its true weight. Not the mystery, not the adventure, the moral gravity of what that treasure represents, and the question of whether the world has genuinely done everything it could to make things right. It has not. The work is not finished, and it will not finish itself. It requires governments and institutions to look honestly at their own histories. It requires Russian archives to be opened with genuine transparency. It requires museums to conduct provenance research, not as a legal obligation to be minimally satisfied, but as a moral commitment to be genuinely honored. And it requires ordinary people who care about fairness and truth to keep demanding answers that powerful institutions would prefer we stopped asking for. Now, I want to say something directly to you. You watched this entire video. You stayed through the history and the complexity and the honest acknowledgement that the most exciting version of this story is probably not the most accurate one. You did not leave when the story got uncomfortable. That matters. The conversation is how historical truth eventually surfaces, not through government announcements or dramatic documentary reveals. Through people, ordinary people exactly like you, who care enough to engage seriously with history, who are willing to sit with uncomfortable uncertainty rather than retreat into comfortable myth. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now, not just your theory about where the train is, though I genuinely want to hear that. Tell me what you think about the bigger question. Has Europe done enough to address what was stolen during the Holocaust? Does the gold train story get told honestly, or does the adventure overshadow the human reality? If a discovery ever came, would it produce real justice or just another argument about who gets to keep the money? These are not simple questions. They deserve to be asked out loud by as many people as possible. Share this video, not for the algorithm, though that helps. Share it because these conversations are better with more voices. Send it to someone who loves history. Send it to someone who thinks the gold train is just a fun mystery and has never thought about where the gold actually came from. If this kind of honest, deep, uncomfortable history is what you want more of, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Every video on this channel is built on the same foundation: serious research. Genuine uncertainty, the refusal to wrap complicated truth in false simplicity just to make a cleaner story. History is not always clean. It does not always give us the endings we want. But it is always worth understanding as fully and as honestly as we can, because the alternative, choosing the comfortable myth over the complicated truth, is how the debts of the past stay unpaid. And some debts have gone unpaid for long enough. The Nazi gold train may be in a tunnel beneath the Owl Mountains. It may never have existed as the legend describes. The truth is probably messier and more scattered and less dramatic than either possibility suggests. But the story of what was stolen, that story is real. The people it was stolen from, they were real, and the obligation we carry toward that reality, that is as real as anything that has ever been buried in the dark beneath a Polish mountain. Keep asking the questions. Keep demanding the answers, and never let the comfortable version of history replace the true one.